The discordant note, the warm lights of the Boston Symphony Hall dimmed as Rosalind Fletcher tucked her violin under her chin. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the 3 cups of coffee she'd consumed before rehearsal. As 4th chair in the string section, she wasn't expected to stand out. That suited her fine. Rosalind had always believed music should speak for itself. "Fletcher, you're dragging again." Julian Pierce's voice cut through the orchestra's harmony. Like a knife. The young associate conductor tapped his baton impatiently against the stand. "This is Tchaikovsky, not a funeral dirge." Rosalind nodded, her cheeks flushing. She'd been experimenting with a slight variation in tempo that she thought brought out the melancholy beneath the composition's surface. Julian, however, was a purist. In his 3 years as her boyfriend, he'd made it abundantly clear that innovation came after mastery, and in his eyes, she hadn't earned the right to innovate. "Sorry," she murmured, though the micro-expression of defiance didn't escape Julian's notice. His jaw tightened before he signaled the orchestra to continue. Later that evening, in their small apartment overlooking the Charles River, the tension resurfaced.
Oh.
Julian paced the living room, wineglass in hand, while Rosalind sat cross-legged on their worn sofa, scribbling in a notebook.
Ow.
"What are you working on now?" he asked, peering over her shoulder at the strange notations a hybrid system. She developed that incorporated elements of traditional scoring with her own symbols for emotional interpretation. "Just some ideas for that community music program," she replied, not looking up. The program worked with underprivileged children, teaching them music through what Rosalind called emotional notation, a system that made classical music more accessible to beginners. Julian sighed. "You have a position with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and you're spending your evenings developing teaching tools for children who can barely hold instruments properly. Those children feel the music in ways that half our orchestra doesn't," Rosalind countered, finally meeting his gaze. "They play from their hearts, not just their training." "Sentiment doesn't fill concert halls," Julian said, setting down his glass with a sharp clink. "I've been offered the guest conductor position with the Vienna Philharmonic for their summer series." Rosalind's eyes widened. "It's incredible. Congratulations." "I want you to come with me," he said. "There's an opening in their string section. Not 4th chair, but it's a start." The implication wasn't subtle. It was a step up by his definition. "Julian, my work here is going nowhere," he finished for her. "Your emotional notation project, the community programs, they're lovely hobbies, Rosa, but they're not a career. You need to level up if you want to be taken seriously." In this world, the word hobby stung more than she cared to admit. Rosalind closed her notebook. "I am serious about my career. Just might not look like yours." 3 weeks later, surrounded by half-packed boxes, Julian delivered his final assessment of their relationship. "We want different things, Rosa. I'm moving toward the international stage. Your content playing in community centers and developing music theories that no conservatory will ever adopt." As he placed his key on the kitchen counter, he added what he thought was kindness. "You're talented, but you're wasting it. Call me when you're ready to join the real music world." The door closed behind him with the finality of a symphony's last note. In the silence of their one-shared apartment, Rosalind picked up her violin and began to play not Tchaikovsky, as written, but as she heard it in her heart, with all the subtle variations that Julian had never allowed. Solo performance, the autumn rain tapped a gentle rhythm against the windows of Rosalind's new apartments. New apartments smaller than the one she'd shared with Julian, but entirely hers. 6 months had passed since their breakup, and while the Boston Symphony Orchestra continued under the temporary direction of Maestro Takahashi, Rosalind had found herself at a crossroads. She still held her 4th chair position, but her heart had increasingly turned toward her emotional notation system. The children at Bridgeview Community Center had flourished under her guidance, connecting with classical compositions through her innovative approach. What had begun as weekend workshops had evolved into a comprehensive program, attracting attention from local music educators. Tonight, Rosalind sat surrounded by scattered papers, annotating Vivaldi's for seasons with her system standard. Notation, interwoven with color-coded symbols representing emotional shifts and intensity. Her phone buzzed with a text from her colleague, Thomas. Jay's Vienna debut made the front page of Classical Monthly. Apparently, he's revolutionizing the Philharmonic. Rosalind set down her pencil, ignoring the subtle twist in her stomach. Julian had indeed leveled up, just as he'd planned. According to his increasingly polished Instagram feed, he'd been photographed with Europe's elite conductors and had recently begun dating Valentina Petrov, a celebrated soprano from the Moscow Conservatory. Good for him, she texted back. Meaning it despite the lingering ache, Thomas replied immediately. Also, that foundation representative is coming to observe your program tomorrow. Don't forget. The Whitmore Music Education Foundation had expressed interest in her work, potentially offering a grant that would allow her to develop her system more fully. It was a modest opportunity compared to Vienna, but it was hers. The next day, Rosalind led a group of 12 children through Mozart's Ein klein Nacht Musik, translated into her notation system. She'd expected the foundation to send there. Education coordinator, a local retired music teacher, when a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit appeared instead, nearly missed a beat in her own demonstration. This section feels bright, like sunlight, she explained to the children, pointing to her annotated score where yellow symbols danced around the traditional notes. See how Mozart builds up to this moment? Should sound like a question being answered. A 10-year-old boy named Diego, who'd struggled with traditional notation for months, nodded vigorously. It's like when you're waiting for something good, and then it happens, he said, before drawing his bow across the strings with surprising sensitivity. After the 2-hour session, as the children packed up their instruments, the suited man approached. Ms. Fletcher, I'm Nikolai Volkov, board member of the Whitmore Foundation. His voice carried a subtle Russian accent, softened by years in America. I hope you don't mind my observation today. Not at all, Rosalind replied, suddenly aware of her casual attire and the ink smudge on her hand, though I was expecting Mrs. Harrington. Evelyn came down with the flu, he explained. I volunteered to come instead. I have a particular interest in alternative education methods. His gray eyes, remarkably perceptive, studied the scores spread across the table. Your system is fascinating.
How long have you been developing it?
Formally, about 3 years. But I've been thinking about music this way my entire life. Nikolai picked up one of her annotated sheets. You're with the Boston Symphony, correct? 4th chair, violin section, she confirmed, mentally preparing for the usual dismissive nod that followed when people learned she wasn't a principal player. Instead, Nikolai's expression remained thoughtful. And your orchestra colleagues, what? Do they think of your methodology? Rosalind laughed softly. Most think it's quaint a teaching tool for children, not serious musicians. And you disagree. I believe music theory has calcified around traditions that serve technical proficiency, but often disconnect performers from emotional authenticity. She said, the words flowing more easily than she'd expected. My system bridges that gap. Over coffee at a nearby cafe, their conversation deepened. Nikolai, she learned, wasn't just a foundation board member, but the founder of Harmony Heights Records, a boutique label known for recording experimental classical performances and rediscovering overlooked compositions. The foundation will certainly approve your grant, he said as they finished their drinks. But I'm interested in something more ambitious. Would you consider developing an adult curriculum? I know several professional musicians who might benefit from reconnecting with the emotional landscape of the pieces they've been playing mechanically for decades. You're serious? Rosalind asked, barely concealing her surprise. Entirely. Handed her his card, simple, elegant, with just his name and contact information. Music isn't just about technical perfection, Miss Fletcher. It's about communication. You understand that better than most conservatory graduates I've met. As Rosalind walked home that evening, clutching Nikolai's card like a talisman, she passed a newsstand displaying Classical Monthly. Julian's confident smile beaming from the cover as he stood before the Vienna Philharmonic. 6 months ago, that image would have reinforced her sense of inadequacy. Tonight, she barely noticed it. Her phone buzzed with an email confirmation from the Whitmore Foundation. Her grant had been approved. With a personal note from Nikolai, suggesting they meet again to discuss expanded applications of her work. For the first time since Julian's departure, Rosalind felt the quiet certainty that she hadn't been left behind. She'd simply been on a different path all along. A new composition spring arrived in Boston with a riot of cherry blossoms and a steady progression in Rosalind's professional life. The Whitmore grant had allowed her to expand her program to 3 community centers, while her collaboration with Nikolai Volkov had evolved into a weekly meeting of minds. Their sessions typically took place in the Harmony Heights Records Studio A converted warehouse in Cambridge. With acoustics so perfect they seemed to caress every note. Today, they sat in the control room, listening to a recording of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata performed by concert pianist Daniel Wong, who had studied Rosalind's notation system for the past month. "Do you hear that?" Nikolai asked, his fingers hovering over the mixing console. "Compare it to his recording from last year." Rosalind nodded, eyes closed in concentration. The difference was subtle, but unmistakably a newfound tenderness. In the pianist's interpretation, sense of longing that the previous recording had technically executed but emotionally missed. "He's found the heartbeat beneath the notes," she said softly. Nikolai smiled, the expression transforming his normally serious face. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Stark contrast to Julian's hungry ambition. Over the past 3 months, Rosalind had learned that Nikolai's seemingly overnight success had actually been built through 15 years of painstaking work. Starting with a single microphone in his basement apartment, recording overlooked musicians he believed deserved to be heard. "We've received inquiries from the San Francisco Conservatory and 2 orchestras in Chicago about your methodology," he said, handing her a folder of correspondence. "Your workshops are gaining attention?" And Rosalind leafed through the letters, a mixture of excitement and disbelief washing over her. "This is unexpected. Is it?" Nikolai raised an eyebrow. "You've created something revolutionary by simply acknowledging. What most classical training ignores that music is meant to move people, not just impress them." Their conversation was interrupted by Nikolai's assistant, Beatrice, who appeared with a tablet displaying the latest classical music charts. "The Wong recording of Chopin released last month just hit number 3, she announced. "The critics are calling it a revelation in emotional depth." After Beatrice left, Nikolai turned to Rosalind with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have a proposition. Harmony Heights is organizing a summer music festival, 3 days of performances outside traditional concert settings. I want your methodology to be central to it." "As a workshop component?" Rosalind asked. "As its philosophical foundation," Nikolai clarified. "Every performer will have the option to work with your system. We'll pair traditional scores with your emotional notation, and audiences will receive programs explaining the approach." The scale of his proposal was staggering. "That's a significant risk for you," she pointed out. "Many classical purists might see it as gimmicky." Nikolai shrugged. "Harmony Heights wasn't built by following conventional wisdom. It was built by recognizing authentic talent like yours." As their planning sessions for the festival intensified, so did the undercurrent between them. Their conversations stretched late into evenings, moving from musical theory to personal philosophies, childhood memories and dreams deferred. Nikolai spoke of his early years in post-Soviet Russia, where his father's collection of smuggled Western classical recordings had been his education. Rosalind shared stories of growing up in a household where music was loved but not understood, her parents supportive but bewildered by her obsession with the emotional structures of compositions. One evening, as they walked along the Charles River after finalizing the festival program, Nikolai stopped and turned to her. "You know, when I first saw you teaching those children, I recognized something I've spent my career searching for." "What's that?" Rosalind asked, aware of how close they were standing, how the setting sun cast gold across his features. "Authenticity," he said simply. "You weren't teaching them to play the notes correctly. You were teaching them to feel the music correctly, and there's a profound difference." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken recognition. When Nikolai finally leaned down to kiss her, it felt like the most natural progression, like a perfectly resolved chord after a tension-filled passage. Later that week, news of the upcoming Harmony Heights Summer Festival spread through Boston's musical community. Rosalind received a text from Thomas at the Symphony. Julian's giving an interview tomorrow on Classical Hour Radio, says he. Has thoughts on experimental notation systems gaining popularity? Heads up. Rosalind set down her phone without replying. 6 months ago, Julian's public criticism would have devastated her. Now, she found herself curious rather than afraid. Her system was no longer a private rebellion, but a methodology with growing validation. More importantly, she had found someone who saw her work not as a charming diversion, but as a vital contribution to musical understanding. That night, she fell asleep in Nikolai's arms. Rosalind realized she no longer measured her worth against Julian's definition of success. She had found her own symphony to conduct. Rising crescendo, the headquarters of Harmony Heights Records hummed with activity as the summer festival approached. In the 3 weeks since their first kiss by the Charles River, Rosalind and Nikolai had developed a rhythm to their relationship that felt both exhilarating and oddly familiar, as though they'd been moving toward each other for years. "The New York Philharmonic just confirmed," announced Beatrice, bursting into Nikolai's office where he and Rosalind were reviewing venue logistics. "They want to send a representative to observe the festival methodology." Nikolai nodded, unsurprised. "Which section head? Better." "Maestro Williams himself." Rosalind looked up from her tablet, stunned. Jerome Williams was not only the Philharmonic's conductor, but served on the board of 3 major conservatories. His interests represented potential mainstream acceptance of her work. And, Beatrice continued with a barely suppressed smile, rolling, "Stone wants to interview Rosalind for their Innovators Reshaping Classical Music issue." After Beatrice left, Nikolai reached across the desk to squeeze Rosalind's hand. "You're not just reaching children in community centers anymore," he said softly. "You're changing the conversation about how we approach classical music." The reality of it was still difficult for Rosalind to grasp. In the months since Julian's radio interview, where he had dismissively referred to trendy notation gimmicks that undermine rigorous musical training, her inbox had flooded with inquiries. Far from damaging her reputation, Julian's criticism had spotlighted her work to those who had grown disillusioned with the rigidity of classical training. That evening, they hosted a dinner for the festival's featured performers at Nikolai's. Beacon Hill, home a warm, book-filled space that reflected its owner's thoughtful nature. As Rosalind circulated among the guests, she overheard snippets of conversation that still seemed surreal. "Fletcher's system gave me permission to trust my instincts again," said Eliza Montgomery, first-chair cellist from the Chicago Symphony. "I'd been playing DVOK the same way for 20 years because that's how it was done." "My students are connecting with Bach for the first time," added Professor Harrison from the Cleveland Institute of Music. "They're seeing the mathematical precision and the emotional landscape simultaneously." Later, as the gathering dispersed, Nikolai poured them both a glass of wine and led Rosalind to the piano room, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston's twinkling skyline. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a slender wooden box from his desk. Inside lay an antique conductor's baton, its ivory handle yellowed with age, its weight perfectly balanced. "This belonged to Antonin Markovich," Nikolai explained. "My father's teacher in Leningrad. He was never famous outside Russia, but he understood what you understand, that technique serves emotion, not the other way around." Rosalind ran her fingers along the baton's length, feeling its history. "Nikolai, I can't accept this." "Ken," he insisted gently, "because you're ready to conduct, Rosalind. Not just advise from the sidelines." The confusion must have shown on her face, because he continued, "The festival's final performance, Beethoven's 7th Symphony. We've assembled musicians from 5 different orchestras, all of whom have been working with your notation. They need a conductor who understands both the technical demands and the emotional architecture. But I've never conducted a full orchestra." She protested. "I'm a violinist who has reimagined how musicians connect with classical compositions," he countered. "The technical aspects of conducting can be taught in weeks. The vision you bring, that's what matters." As she opened her mouth to object further, he added, "Julian's Vienna Philharmonic will be performing at the Cambridge International Festival. The same weekend, many critics will attend both events. This is your moment to demonstrate that there are multiple paths to musical excellence." The mention of Julian's name no longer triggered insecurity, but rather a calm determination. You're asking me to make a statement. I'm asking you to be who you already are, Nikolai corrected. The musicians respect you. They've seen how your approach transforms their playing. They'll follow your baton because they believe in your vision. 2 weeks later, Rosalind stood before a full orchestra for her first formal conducting rehearsal. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised the baton, but when she began, something remarkable happened. The musicians, all veterans of prestigious orchestras, responded to her direction with an openness she hadn't anticipated. Her lack of traditional conducting experience became irrelevant as they found a shared language in the emotional architecture of Beethoven's symphony. That night, turning to her apartment to pack the last of her belongings for her move into Nikolai's home, Rosalind found a small package in her mailbox. Inside was a vintage recording of Beethoven's Seventh, conducted by Leonard Bernstein. The note from Nikolai. He understood what you understand, that technique without passion is just noise. 3 days until you show the world. The record on her turntable and the first notes filled her apartment. Rosalind felt a serene confidence replace her earlier anxiety. In less than a year, she had journeyed from Julian's dismissal to discovering her true musical voice and finding someone who amplified rather than diminished it. The festival would be a culmination, but also a beginning. Whatever came next, she would face it not as Julian's failed protege, but as her authentic self. The grand finale, the final day of the Harmony Heights Summer Festival, dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming magnolias across Boston Common. The 3-day event had exceeded all expectations, drawing not only the anticipated classical music enthusiasts, but a surprising number of younger attendees, many experiencing orchestral performances for the first time. In the festival's green room, Rosalind stood before a mirror, adjusting the sleeves of her conducting attire, midnight blue suit with subtle musical notation embroidered along the lapels, custom designed by a local fashion house that had approached her after the Rolling Stone feature appeared. The article, titled "The Emotional Revolutionary," positioned her methodology not as a rejection of classical tradition, but as its evolution. 10 minutes, Miss Fletcher, called the stage manager. Poking his head through the door, Rosalind nodded, taking a deep breath. Tonight's performance of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony would be the festival's crowning event. Broadcast live by National Public Radio and recorded for Harmony Heights' upcoming release. More significantly, the audience would include representatives from 7 major conservatories and orchestras from across the country. Solfnock preceded Nikolai's entrance. In his charcoal tuxedo, with a single white rose for his boutonniere, he looked both distinguished and approachable, the perfect embodiment of Harmony Heights philosophy. "The Cambridge International Festival called," he said, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "They've asked if we'd consider a collaboration next season. Apparently their younger board members attended our workshops and were impressed." Rosalind smiled, recognizing the significance. The Cambridge International. Was Julian's current triumph the festival that had cemented his reputation as Europe's rising conductor? "Nervous?" Nikolai asked, studying her face. "Surprisingly, no," she replied truthfully. "These musicians believe in what we're doing. That makes all the difference." He kissed her forehead gently. "I have news that I've been saving. What? Foundation in Hungary has created a fellowship in your name for musicians, developing alternative approaches to classical education." Before she could respond, there was another knock. This time, it was Beatrice, looking unusually flustered. "Julian Pierce is here," she announced. "He's asking to speak with Rosalind before the performance." Nikolai's expression darkened slightly. "Did he say why?" "Just that it's important." Beatrice glanced at Rosalind. "He's with Valentina Petrov and several Vienna Philharmonic board members." Rosalind exchanged a look with Nikolai. "It's fine. Show him in." When Julian entered, Rosalind was struck by how unchanged yet unfamiliar he seemed, like a photograph she'd memorized, but was now seeing in person for the first time. His presence, once so central to her life, now felt peripheral. "Rosa," he began, then corrected himself. "Rosalind. Thank you for seeing me." Beside him, Valentina Petrov was even more striking in person than in photograph, tall, elegant, with the commanding presence expected of a world-class soprano. Your festival has created quite a stir in our circles, Julian continued. I've been hearing about your methodology from Vienna to Moscow. Rosalind waited, sensing there was more. The Vienna Philharmonic is expanding its education outreach, he said, his tone carefully diplomatic. The board is interested in incorporating alternative approaches to classical training. They've asked me to discuss the possibility of you conducting a workshop series next spring. The irony wasn't lost on Rosalind. Here was Julian, who had dismissed her work as a hobby, now extending a professional olive branch at the behest of the very institution he'd once held up as the pinnacle of classical purity. That's a generous offer, she replied evenly. Though I'm committed to Harmony Heights Education Initiative through next year, Julian nodded, a flash of his old impatience crossing his features. Perhaps we could discuss it after your performance tonight. The board members are quite eager what Julian means. Valentina interrupted, her accent lending a musical quality to her English. Is that we've been arguing about your approach for weeks? I believe you're onto something revolutionary. Julian thinks there might be applications for select educational contexts. It was diplomatic phrasing for what was clearly a deeper disagreement. Rosalind suppressed a smile, imagining the heated debates her former boyfriend must have endured as his precious Vienna Philharmonic became interested in the very approach he'd dismissed. You're welcome to join us for dinner tomorrow, Nikolai, offered smoothly, stepping forward. We'd be happy to discuss potential collaborations then. Something shifted in Julian's expression as he finally registered the nature of Rosalind and Nikolai's relationship. His gaze traveled from their matched boutonnieres to the easy way they stood together. Of course he managed. Congratulations on the festival's success and your ... partnership. As they left, Valentina lingered briefly. Your Rolling Stone interview changed my approach to Puccini, she said quietly. For what it's worth, I think Vienna needs what you've developed far more than you need Vienna. 5 minutes later, Rosalind stepped onto the conductor's platform to thunderous applause. Before her stood musicians from across the country, each with her annotated score on their standard notation, intertwined with her emotional mapping system. As she raised Antonin Markovic's baton, Rosalind caught sight of Julian and his entourage taking their seats in the third row. Once, his presence would have filled her with anxiety. Tonight it was merely an interesting footnote in a story that had long since taken its own direction. The first movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony began with a prolonged introduction, at first, then building toward resolution. As Rosalind guided the orchestra through its emotional landscape, she felt the audience leaning forward, experiencing the familiar composition with fresh understanding. From the corner of her eye, she saw Nikolai standing in the wings, his expression a mixture of pride and love. 6 months ago, Julian had told her she needed to level up to match his ambitions. Instead, she had found her own path, one that had led to this moment of culmination and recognition. When the symphony concluded, the audience rose in a standing ovation that continued for nearly 5 minutes. As Rosalind took her final bow, she caught Julian's gaze across the theater. He was applauding too, his expression unreadable, but his acknowledgement unmistakable. Later that night, as she and Nikolai walked hand in hand through the quiet festival grounds, he asked, "Will you consider Vienna's offer?" Rosalind looked up at the stars, considering, perhaps on my terms, not Julian's. "What are Rosalind? Fletcher's terms these days?" he asked with a smile. She stopped, turning to face him fully. "That I won't diminish my work to fit someone else's vision. That the emotional truth of music matters as much as its technical execution. And," she added, reaching up to touch his face, "that I partner only with those who see my differences as strengths, not limitations." Nikolai's kiss was a promise of understanding, of mutual respect, of a shared vision that had brought them together when they least expected it. As they continued their walk, Rosalind thought about the winding path that had led her here. Julian had been right about one thing: she had needed to evolve. But the evolution hadn't been toward his definition of success. It had been toward her own authentic voice. The Harmony Heights Summer Festival had put that voice on the map. Whatever came next, whether Vienna workshops or conservatory lectures or simply continuing to develop her methodology with Nikolai's support, would be on her terms. conducted with the confidence of someone who no longer needed external validation to know her worth. The night air carried the lingering notes of Beethoven's symphony, passionate, triumphant, and ultimately true to itself. Just like her,